like to invite Alex Fry to come up. Dr. Alex Fry is Senior Lecturer in the Sociology of Health and Illness at Bournemouth University.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation to come and speak today. It might seem odd having this presentation from a sociologist of health and illness, so I should probably explain that slightly. I started off as a sociologist of religion and gender. That was my PhD, which actually I did at the same time as Sharon on almost exactly the same question. It's just where Sharon was looking at women's experiences of working with traditionalist clergymen, I was looking at the attitudes of those clergymen themselves, although we never actually came into contact with each other up until probably our PhDs were done and dusted, did we? So that's where I've come from, and just for again, just for a bit of context, my research since my PhD has focused around religion, health and well-being. And in fact, not just religion, but belief more broadly. So that's kind of been my career trajectory. But really, at its heart, I would say I'm a sociologist of religion who happens to do some research on religion and health and well-being. But anyway, for today, I'm essentially going to be giving a broad overview rather than a deep dive into this research, which, as I said, started off as a doctoral piece of work. I'm not going to rehearse the different theologies around women's ordination. I'm aware that you all will be knowledgeable of them and have experienced them as well throughout your ministries. And I'm also aware that Mark has given us a very useful historical backdrop, so I won't be going into that either. The other thing I wanted to say, really, about the question, theology or misogyny, it's very interesting. I would say, as a social scientist, that to explain how something comes to be in social terms doesn't explain something away. We can understand social scientific factors coming to influence the world in various ways, much in the same way that we can understand natural science explaining the origins of the world without saying that actually that leaves no room for God. So I'm very much a firm believer that the Holy Spirit can and does work through social scientific mechanisms. The only thing I would say to caveat that is bearing in mind the data, which I'm going to go into in just a moment. I don't think, personally, that given my findings, we can say, with all honesty, that the ordination of women is a matter of conscience. I don't think my social scientific findings are compatible with the concept of a conscience as the church has understood it historically. So just as a matter of transparency, that's my assumption, that's where I'm coming from. I don't think social science explains things away, but at the same time, I don't think the attitudes of those I interviewed who oppose women's ordination are compatible with the concept of a conscience as the church has understood that term historically. So, my research basically asks, why do some men oppose the ordination of women priests and their consecration as bishops? And I just want to check, is that echo isn't too much for people in the audience, is it? No, that's fine for you, good. And essentially, I looked at the historical, sociological, and psychological factors that shape or influence traditionalist gender attitudes. And more specifically, this question really is helping, well, first of all, me to understand, but also the wider church, why different people can read the same sacred texts and lean on the same church tradition, and yet come to radically different experiences and understandings of what is and isn't acceptable. And to do that, I interviewed 41 male clergy from conservative traditions within the Church of England. They were all in the same diocese. I've not named the diocese anywhere. That's just part of the research ethics I agreed to when undertaking the research under kind of Durham University's kind of banner. But it is fair to say that it is a microcosm of the church in terms of theology's present and churchmanship. It's also a geographical microcosm of England, in that it has a mixture of urban, suburban and rural areas as well. So it was fairly representative in that respect. It's a microcosm of the Church of England, ultimately. Now, out of my 41 participants, 13 were traditional Anglo-Catholic, most of whom, I think 6 actually, were explicitly signed up to Forward in Faith, and the rest of them were within those networks and had those theologies without formally being a member. Except 2 of those participants had actually moved over the years, and so are still very much immersed in not just Anglo-Catholicism, but more traditional Anglo-Catholicism, but yet have moved specifically on the question of women's ordination as priests and consecration as bishops. I interviewed 14 conservative evangelicals. 13 of them were part of Reform as it was then. I believe it's now been amalgamated into the Church Society and is no longer its own organisation. But at the time of the research, it was very much standalone. And the 14th conservative evangelical that I interviewed was considering membership of Reform at this time. He was active within it. That was his primary social network of clergy. And very much his theology was one of that complementarian headship model. And then I interviewed 14 charismatic evangelicals. This was the broadest group, it was the most diverse, and a number of them had actually incorporated kind of a wide variety of the Church of England's spiritualities within their own practice. So they weren't sort of cut and dry charismatics in that respect. They weren't kind of franchised charismatic evangelicals, if that makes sense. They were actually a very broad and diverse group. And I mostly got my data through semi-structured interviews. So in essence, that is just sitting down and talking with people with a defined list of questions, open-ended, but letting participants very much steer the conversations in ways that they feel relevant. But I was also invited to take part in some services as well. So if they had a weekday communion service on the day I was interviewing the clergy person, I would come along to that. And that was very eye-opening, actually. So I found myself in one Forward in Faith parish where the priest did the Mass partly in Latin with his back to the congregation in that pre-Vatican II style service, which was very telling. As my supervisor said when I was explaining to her, that was not an accident. That's a very deliberate messaging. And actually, having been brought up in the Catholic Church originally, with a kind of Irish Catholic background, I had experienced that, but even in the Catholic Church, that was an anomaly today. So to see that in the C of E was really quite something. And then structured observations. That was the structured observations. The ethnographic observations were really me kind of taking notes around vicars' studies, if that's where we met, or their church buildings, using the material surroundings as a prompt for questions. And again, that could be a very telling. It was a really good way of collecting data I hadn't planned to collect, but actually was vital to the research. So just to give one example, I was interviewing someone from Forward in Faith. My interviews were designed to last about an hour, and I was there for 3 hours and 3/4. But what this particular individual did was took me around parts of his home to show me different pictures of his family life and so on, only because there was a picture on his desk and I asked him a question about family, and then That opened up, I suppose, a whole avenue of conversation I wasn't anticipating. That's one of the great things about, doing flexible research. You can gather these, data that actually you weren't expecting, and you get an insight into people's lived experience in a way that you weren't expecting. But as he took me around his house, there was this quite large canvas in his dining room, and I just asked him about it because, it was quite large. I thought, oh, maybe he's really into art. And he said, oh, yes, that's a feminist painting. And he was quite kind of proud as he told me this. And there is a purpose to this story, by the way. This isn't incidental. And I said, oh, okay, how do you know it's a feminist painting? And he said, oh, well, you see those, and it was mostly a blue canvas with some yellow flowers. And he said, oh, well, did you know that feminist flowers represent female orgasm? And I said, no, I didn't know that. How do you know that? And he said, with his face sort of slightly dropped to the floor, oh, my friend who painted it told me she's a feminist. And so what these incidences, these unplanned incidences actually facilitated was some really raw honesty behind a kind of trying to appear to be something that perhaps they're not entirely. And I think that speaks a bit into Sharon's research of kind of fudging the language, I think there's an awareness that their gender values aren't represented within society and indeed the church, probably not necessarily amongst their congregations either. And so I think there's this pressure to play to an audience. But the way in which I collected data seemed to be able to dissolve a lot of that without me even really trying to do it. So really, that's just an advocate for qualitative research for these sorts of questions and topics. And over the last few years, I've published a number of things, which are on the next slide, in this order. The religion and gender article, so the first 4 are journal articles, I've co-written with Sharon. We've finally found time to collect our, compare our data. And that is going to be released imminently. I think I'm holding it up with my proofreading. Yep, the pointing finger is telling me I am. So as soon as that is done, hopefully next week, that will be published very quickly. And then this has the kind of crux of the research really is in my book. I believe that the discount code of ADJF45 still gets the ebook nearly half price. It's the only just about affordable way to get it because I'm afraid Routledge do price their hardbacks for university libraries. Although I do have a submission in with a church-facing publisher at the moment, and I'm hoping to create a kind of broader book at a much more reasonable price for the church that explores social scientific factors that come to shape our theology. Beyond the question of women's ordination, but that will probably be a case study. So, what did clergymen actually come to think about women's ordination? Because what they said when anonymized is actually quite different to what you might hear in the pulpit. And in actual fact, Sharon very kindly hosted a seminar with the social justice, the Centre for Social Justice at York St John, and I unpacked some of that there. But before I get onto that, it is worth, on the next slide, just unpacking a bit about clergy's identities, the identities of clergymen. Because if we're to understand why they hold the views that they do, we need to understand this. And you might well be, I'm sure many of you are familiar with the concept of intersectionality. In essence, it's the idea that we all hold multiple interlocking identities that come to shape who we are. And in different contexts, they can facilitate privilege or discrimination, and perhaps sometimes even both simultaneously. It's not a zero-sum thing. And usually, intersectionality is used as a lens to explore how people experience discrimination. But what I actually ended up doing is using it as a way to explore how those who have discriminatory attitudes might well come to discriminate. And so it's worth just briefly going through each of these. Class, for example, is a very easy one. Okay, the vast majority were middle class, but particularly upper middle class. They'd gone to Oxbridge, even pre-ordination training, particularly for the conservative evangelicals, actually. They had generally been very well educated prior to university, some going to boarding schools and private schools. Again, that was most obvious for the conservative evangelicals, least obvious for the charismatic evangelicals, with the traditional Anglo-Catholics being somewhere in between. When it comes to ethnicity, they were all white, with two exceptions who had kind of mixed heritage. And again, those two exceptions were in the charismatic evangelicals. Okay, so that is the most diverse group that I interviewed. And actually, interestingly, and there is a link, I believe, also the most affirming of women's ordained ministry as well. So that is relevant, and I'll unpack that in a short bit. They have their vocational identity as priests in the Church of England, or presbyters, as some of them would prefer to be called. And they have their immediate tradition, so whether they're traditional Catholic, charismatic evangelical, conservative evangelical, as well as their wider tradition, which of course is Anglican. Their familial identities seems relevant as well, certainly for the conservative evangelicals, because their theology is men are not just leaders in the church, but also in the household. So that complementarian model is reflected both in the family sphere as well as the church sphere. Gender identity, of course, they are all cisgender, so they all identify as male. There's that kind of essentialism, which Sharon alluded to earlier. I am biologically male, therefore I am a man, and therefore I have the cultural roles that the church has traditionally ascribed to being a man. Sexuality is slightly more interesting, actually. They were all heterosexual other than half of the traditional Catholics, other than 7 of them, who 7 of them identified as being gay, some of them in civil partnerships, others of them not, and they sort of tiptoed around the question of sexuality, so I didn't push it, but I certainly found it very interesting, and actually I'll unpack the relevance for that for the group as a whole in just a moment's time. But that's basically their intersectionality. So for most of them, they had multiple identities of privilege. And so moving on to the next slide, well, what did I actually find beyond that when it comes to their particular views? Well, before I just give a few representative quotes, I want to explain the framework that I used to interpret my data. I didn't set out to use this framework. I think I was probably just a bit naive when I set out on my PhD, but I realized very quickly that what participants were saying regularly reflected something called ambivalent sexism. It's a well-established psychological theory that dates back to the 90s and actually has even earlier roots going back to the 1930s. It's been slightly refined over time, but studies time and again across cultures, continents, and decades affirm the reliability of this definition of sexism. And it's ambivalent because there's 2 types. And someone can hold one type and not the other, or they can hold both together. And sometimes it's even context dependent. But hostile sexism is basically, you know, that thing that we all know to be sexism, that everyone would say, yeah, that's sexist. It's that very militant sort of response to a woman who isn't necessarily adopting a social role that is expected of them, right? That's what that is. Then indirect sexism, I'm the only person who calls it this. It was coined as benevolent sexism. So I decided actually when it came to writing the PhD, indirect was probably better. It's the idea that we can have attitudes towards women that appear subjectively positive on the surface, but actually undermine conception of women's competence. Now, bear in mind, the term benevolent sexism was coined in '96. So I think that's probably why it wasn't quite seen as problematic a term as we might have it today. Whether the wider literature changes the language is yet to be seen. But when it comes to these two different types of sexism, conservative evangelicals, all of them, without exception, evidenced indirect sexism. And just as an example of this, here we are. One participant said to me, "We are equal in status, we are both created in the image of God, both made of the same stuff, both creatures under God as the creator, but we are different in role. And therefore, it's my responsibility and role to function as the head of the household, and it's my wife's role to submit to my leadership in marriage." So that's very much that complementarian approach. And actually, that was accompanied by phrases like equal but different, again, just nodding back to what Sharon was talking about earlier. It's always useful when research dovetails and when actually you have replicate findings. Now, when it comes to hostile sexism, that very overt sort of what you might call women-hating approach, about half, exactly half, evidenced hostile sexism. The other half, although they didn't fully meet the definition, you could see there were traits there. There are words like angry or militant to describe feminism in a very broad brush way. And in our joint article, Sharon and I actually unpack that kind of attacking of a straw woman, the caricaturing of feminism and feminists. But that was there, and although I focused mostly on individual attitudes and personal prejudice, it goes to show that even if one doesn't quite tick the box for prejudice, in this case sexism, we are still immersed in environments, we have those social structures that come to shape how we think, and it can be less overt, but nevertheless still problematic. The charismatic evangelicals were very different. There were two who had traditional theologies of gender. The other 12, yes, doing my maths, did not. But what was interesting is that those who articulated a more traditional view didn't clearly evidence sexism in terms of internalized personal prejudice. They didn't kind of meet the psychological criteria, which is interesting, and I think that speaks to the social group that they were operating in, because they weren't regularly in meetings with conservative evangelicals. They were regularly in meetings, praying alongside, walking alongside clergy with much more egalitarian values. That level of prejudice just doesn't seem to be internalized. And indeed, the churches they've come from and the training colleges they went to were quite similar in that respect as well. So they've not had the opportunity to really kind of run with that complementarian theology. So there's a softening, which isn't to say it's unproblematic again. The fact that those views are there, again, going back to Sharon's idea of symbolic violence, that can still be perpetuated without people holding personal prejudice. That's one of the things that makes this so tricky. But it was interesting to note that they were the most heterogeneous group, they were the most diverse group, with a tradition of women leaders in the charismatic tradition, and were actually the most accepting or permissive. And so one charismatic said, for example, it's very difficult to generalize about characteristics of male or female leadership. However, female leadership can be emotionally more intelligent. So it's not quite saying women are inherently this, men are inherently this. It's recognizing that there are perhaps general trends in our society, but also perhaps risking caricature at the same time. It's kind of that liminal space. And Anglo-Catholics Well, as I said, two changed their mind on the matter. They didn't evidence any kind of sexism, but the rest did evidence hostile sexism. And interestingly, they didn't evidence indirect sexism. And what the literature shows is that indirect sexism is actually a heterosexual and perhaps bisexual phenomenon, primarily, because it results from the sense of vulnerability that men can feel when they are romantically reliant on women. So that's part of the source of where that kind of sexism comes from. It's a desire not to be vulnerable. So this isn't to say that the logic works in reverse. If someone is gay, they're not more likely to have hostile sexism. But if they do have hostile sexism, there's a good chance that they are gay, whereas they are probably not going to be have indirect sexism. So that's just an interesting difference between the Anglo-Catholics and the evangelicals. And just to put the hostile sexism into perspective, again with the two short quotes, please excuse me, I realise we're not at the watershed, but nevertheless, this is what was said in the interview. And I asked them about feminism. And one very dejected priest said, "Oh, fuck feminism." And then there was a short silence, to which he said, "Well, fuck everybody." Interestingly, whilst that was a representative sentiment, it was particularly strong because as a gay man from a working class background, he had his own struggles with the church and was actually quite resentful that what he saw as being equality for women but not for gay people. And of course, as we've already seen, the idea that women are now equal is a very problematic and faulty one. But that was his perception. And then someone else I asked said, again an Anglo-Catholic, said, well, feminists should get a life, basically. And again, it's one of those instances where the mask kind of falls off, because I think he was expecting me to laugh, and I wasn't expecting that answer at all. And I didn't quite know what to say, so I thought, well, poker face researcher is probably the best way to go. And then he started to backtrack. But nevertheless, it was already said. And I suspect I'm running out of time.
You have run out of time.
I have run out of time, my apologies.
Wrap up.
Yeah, absolutely. So, very quickly, and I'm happy to have this conversation afterwards, but on the final slide, you will see why was the kind of privileged intersectionality an issue? The answer is, it's a threat to one's self-esteem. Our self-esteem is how we measure our relationships to other people, and we want to belong to groups that have higher levels of self-esteem. The way in which we typically do this is by denying others cultural resources such as status, particularly if we are part of high-status groups. Not universally for high-status groups, but particularly. And in a nutshell, that, I argue in my book, is the overarching subconscious motivation that those who object to women's ordination have. And that's why I struggle to marry this with the idea of theological conscience. But anyway, apologies for taking longer than planned, and thank you very much for your attention.